I'd like to offer a warm welcome to all of us or those of you who are joining us this evening. My name is Nick Westcott. I'm the director of the Royal African Society, and we are organising this seminar along with a number of colleagues who will make up the panel and will be introduced by our chair in a second. The Royal African Society exists to allow African voices to be heard on the world stage, and particularly in the UK. We have just this week, yesterday, in fact, published a report on how Africa can be better represented in British schools, published by the Africa All-Party Parliamentary Group, which I commend to you. But our subject today is Ukraine and Africa. This is a very important issue, and you will all be aware of the ubiquitous coverage on the world media of this particular crisis. But it is important to underline that as it continues, and there's a risk of it turning into a war of attrition that will continue, and the repercussions spread around the world, that Africa's position and the impact of the conflict on Africa will become more and more important. So we thought this discussion was timely to understand where Africa and African countries sit at the moment and how they might be impacted. In Europe and North America, the response to the Ukraine crisis has been very much conditioned by the historical experience of the Second World War. Standing up to a dictator who appears to be breaching the rules of sovereignty, international borders, claiming that their security is only assured if they can actually take over the control of bordering countries. And this is seen as a major threat to a world order that has been based on multilateral institutions and the rule of law. And it has given rise to a remarkable unity between European, North American countries to try and protect Ukrainian sovereignty and enable the Ukrainian people to choose their own government. In Africa, views are more divergent. There isn't a single view. And the historical frame of reference is a different one. The references tend to be back to the Cold War. And at that stage, the Soviet Union supported the liberation movements against the Western imperial powers. So it's a very different perspective from which the conflict is perceived. Some, eloquently expressed by the Kenyan ambassador to the UN Security Council, Martin Kimani, see the invasion as rolling back the independence and sovereignty that have been achieved through the independence struggle, and a violation of international borders that have been set and agreed. And Russia's action is seen as, from that point of view, a denial of what was achieved at independence. Others, however, see the West as profoundly hypocritical in this, happy to break the international rule of law when it suited them, but appealing to it when it was in their own interests. And the cases of Libya, Iraq are cited frequently, and point out that the multilateral system that is so treasured actually leaves Africa in a disadvantaged position. So many feel that it is Africa's place to sit on the fence, not to take sides in this. But there's a deeper question here, which our panel will discuss. What kind of world do African countries want to live in? Is it one where spheres of influence become more important, where you accept great power rivalry and you pick a side? Or is it one where we actually try to strengthen multilateral institutions and the rule of law to help protect smaller, weaker countries? And would Africa benefit more from one form or the other? And I think that is something that we need to address. I'm very pleased to be able to welcome today Shuvai Nyoni, who is a gender and security practitioner and researcher, currently researching a PhD, South Sudan, amongst other things, but is currently the executive director of the African Leadership Center, based in Nairobi, but currently speaking to us today from London. Shuvai, very warm welcome, and I hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Nick, and thank you very much to the Royal Africa Society for the invitation to this afternoon's very timely and critical conversation. It's my pleasure to moderate this panel today, made up of an extremely esteemed set of people who have already been making interventions on this subject over the last month, as we have seen this conflict unfold in Ukraine. Nick, thank you for outlining some critical questions. What kind of world do African states or African countries want to live in? Excuse me, and I think even as we discuss this evening, I also think there are more questions that I hope our panelists will help us think through. The one is the impacts on the African continent of this conflict, and Nick, you've already alluded to this: the economic, the political, the security, and strategic impacts of this conflict. The second, which I think is really critical, is around the conversations that are taking place. And Nick has already alluded to some of the historical ties of African countries to the region where this conflict is playing out. But, you know, what are the conversations that are set in history, the historical relations and ties, the conversations that speak to the present? So when we think about the way that African countries voted in the UN General Assembly and what this signifies, and the conversations that speak to the future. We have future African people, those who will be making decisions, policy decisions in the future, you know, making those decisions tomorrow. They have been affected and they are speaking and having conversations about these things. And should Africa be concerned at all? I think we all agree that there should be a concern, but how exactly should this concern be demonstrated? How do we contribute? How do we mediate, if we should? And how do we innovate in the spaces that are available to this? For myself as an African and as an African woman who has been involved and witnessed crises and conflicts of this nature, I don't have an answer to any of these questions, but thankfully for myself and those of you in the audience, I won't be answering any of these questions today or attempting to, but our really esteemed panel will be sharing some of their thinking on these questions. And today we have with us Murithi Mutiga, who is a program director for Africa at the International Crisis Group, and he's based in Nairobi. He previously covered East Africa for The Guardian, and before that, he was a contributing op-ed writer to the International New York Times. And I would like to invite you, Murithi, to share with us some of your thoughts on these questions and others. So you have the floor.
Thanks, Shuvai, and thanks to everyone for joining. Sadly, I don't think I'll have all the answers, as you very generously put it, Shuvai. But I think a couple of things to say. One is that this conflict came as an enormous surprise. Maybe shock would be too strong a word, but it did surprise a lot of policymakers on the continent. I think, you know, when I reflect on some of the commentary in the run-up to the conflict, most people thought the Russians were bluffing. Not too many people expected to see a full-on interstate war at this stage. And so, you know, it's understandable that people are still formulating their responses, and it's still early days. But I would say, just taking it up from where Nick left, that there are roughly 4 categories of responses that we've seen. There were the supporters, very strong supporters of the UN General Assembly resolution condemning what ultimately they worded as Russian aggression. And, you know, the likes of Kenya, the likes of Ghana fell into that category. And their reasoning was that if you allow the violation of you know, recognized boundaries, if you know, you violate countries' sovereignty, that then you might open up a Pandora's box. As we know, many on the African continent worry about some of these issues. You know, irredentist ambitions exist in many parts of the continent, and there are many shared cultures that straddle colonial boundaries, and people didn't want to see that Pandora's box opened in a way that might then set an example that could be destabilizing. Of course, there's a second category, which Nick also mentioned, the frontline countries, as we came to call them, in the 80s in particular, but also in the 70s. And you know, you have to really account for the fact that these are countries, particularly in Southern Africa, but including even beyond the Tanzanias of this world, where the Soviet Union was a very strong supporter, not just ideologically, but also in terms of sending men and resources in the battle against apartheid in particular. And so while they position themselves for now as saying that they are supporting dialogue, in reality, history matters and conditions some of their responses, which of course, I have to say, trigger a substantial internal debate. It doesn't mean that what governments do is exactly what the population completely supports, but we have to account for that history when examining their position. So the third category is probably where most lie. There's a strong history of an unaligned movement on the continent. The likes of Senegal's founding leader, Leopold Senghor, the likes of Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, were very strong in their perception that Africa needed to be non-aligned in a time of great power competition. As some have pointed out, therefore, some in this category don't see this as a war between Russia and Ukraine, in which case there would have been more sympathy. But then they viewed it in the prism of Russia versus the West, and therefore they opted, some would call it fence-sitting, but they would call it non-alignment. There's a substantial number of countries in that category. I think the fourth and final one is one that's quite interesting and will bear watching in the days ahead. These are countries which, particularly since 2014, when Russia's isolation began with the events in Crimea, which have become very situationally dependent on Moscow. These are countries in the Sahel, in the Central African Republic, in Chad, for example, to a certain degree, Sudan, where private military contractors, as they're called, from Russia, have become very important providers and supporters of the security systems in those countries. And so what happens now? To what degree will Russia be distracted? Might it get bogged down, as some analysts suggest? Does that mean that they will pull back? To which extent will these countries come under pressure to make a choice one way or the other? I think that's really important. It's key to watch. What will the impact be? Again, it's very early days, but I'll just point to 3 quick points. One is that the timing is atrocious. This is a region that's already trying to recover from the economic shock from COVID. Nobody really expected yet another massive shock to the global system. And so what will this mean? I know one of, we'll discuss this further in this panel, but just to say that the timing is terrible, the fiscal space to respond is inadequate. I think you might enter an era of great power competition. And as Nick alluded, it tends to be that smaller countries benefit from an order in which there is relative stability and predictability. When you're forced to choose, as we saw, for example, in the Horn of Africa, countries like Somalia have never recovered from the wars in which the various great powers of the time funded and armed various countries, including Ethiopia against Somalia, for example, and vice versa. And so nobody really wants such a world. Most prefer stability and order, and that will be worrying. And how countries respond will be worth watching. And so the impact on local conflicts will also be critical. This is a period in which places like the Sahel are going through significant tumult. And now, they had turned to Moscow for support. It will be worth watching what happens in terms of the actual security situation. But more broadly, and in closing, I would say that, yes, major norms have been challenged. The whole question of sovereignty, territorial integrity is up in the air. The whole question of multilateralism. And some would say that maybe this is a moment in which the continent needs to invest in its own multilateral institutions to respond to what might be a period of disorder going forward.
Thank you so much, Murithi, for those for that range of framing ideas and thoughts, and adding more questions and some possible conundrums to the mix that we already have on the table. Let's turn now to Cheta. Chetan Wanze is the lead partner at SBM Intelligence, which is a Nigerian think tank that focuses on geopolitics and socioeconomic issues. He has worked in numerous information technology and media organizations. He is also widely published in Nigeria and other parts of the world in publications such as Business Day, The Vanguard, Premium Times, and the Mail and Guardian, just to name a few. You will also note, audience members, that the bios are going up in the chat box. I forgot to mention at the very beginning that please, we do encourage you to interact this evening in this conversation, and please do put your questions and your comments in the Q&A box, which is enabled for you to do so. And as we go throughout the conversation, we will be referring to your questions. So please, as they're ready, don't hold back, please do share them. Also, this event is being streamed live on Facebook. And also, if you want to tweet, you can use the Royal Africa Society Twitter handle, as well as a hashtag Ukraine Africa, which will be put in the chat box already. So thank you so much. But Cheta, over to you. We look forward to hearing what you have to say, and we have already been following some of your commentary on this. So please, the floor is yours.
Okay, good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me. Nick started by asking a very important question, and I think this question should frame every discussion that follows. What kind of world do we want to live in? Is it one where we accept spheres of influence, or is it one in which we accept multilateralism? I think that's a very important question. I don't have all the answers because for a start, we have this issue of framing Africa as a single entity, which it's not. As of the last count, there are 54, 55, 50, or 56 countries in Africa, depending on who you speak with. And each of them has its own interests. In ECOWAS alone, the sub-region from which I come, it's one thing has been very clear. The interests of the Francophone West African countries are different from the interests of the Anglophone West African countries. That is something that should frame that should be involved, at least not necessarily frame the conversation, but should be there. Like Murithi, I was very surprised that the conflict started at all. In my opinion, Putin had the Ukrainians where he wanted them. Ukraine wasn't going to join NATO because they would not have been able to get all NATO members to assent to their joining. Ukraine was also in a position where it would have been very difficult for them to join the EU because of things like corruption and general instability in the country. So this was a huge surprise. However, it put something on the table that is very, very important. We are headed back into a world of spheres of influence. That's a realist view of geopolitics. Do I like it? No, I don't like it, but we have to accept that that's where it is. We've been in a unipolar world for the last 3 decades, and I think that the unipolar world is coming to an end regardless. So what will be the effect of that? Pandora's box has been opened. So we have to start looking at the different areas of instability in our continent, because those will be the primary areas of geopolitical competition. And we also have to look at geographical locations. Turkey, for example, is going to be a major player, especially as the French are withdrawing. The Americans will be back. I mean, the Americans already sent a delegation to Equatorial Guinea to talk to them because the Chinese are trying to build a military base. These are unfortunately brutal facts. So what are we going to do about it as Africans? How do we play for our interests? Because at the end of the day, the bitter truth is that geopolitics, global international geopolitics, is not about human rights, it's not about morality, it's about naked, cold interests. So these are the questions that we should be asking ourselves. What are our interests? And we need to also place those interests in the light of what is happening within our continents. The borders that we have accepted for so long, since the 1960s, in many cases are beginning to break down. And this will be a cause of instability as time goes on, these borders that are breaking down, because the experiments of placing sometimes seemingly incompatible peoples together in countries may be unraveling. Is it something that we like? No, I don't think it's something that we like, but again, it's a reality. tectonic plates are shifting, and do we have the means, the wherewithal to stop those tectonic plates from shifting? I sincerely doubt that. I look forward to a very interesting conversation with all of you good people, and let's enjoy.
Thank you so much, Cheta, for those ideas and also those added questions, and really, reminding us about the current state of the continent and what the continent itself is experiencing in relation to borders, artificially created borders, etc. Now we will turn to Dr. Greg Mills, who heads the Johannesburg-based Brenthurst Foundation that was established in 2005 by the Oppenheimer family to strengthen African economic performance. Dr. Mills, in his role, has worked with numerous African governments, including Rwanda, Mozambique, Swaziland, Malawi, to name a few, and continues at various levels to work even with the government of South Africa. Dr. Greg, over to you to hear some of your thoughts and add to this very interesting pot that we have going here. The floor is yours, sir.
Thanks very much, Shivai. I hope that the bandwidth in Lusaka holds up to what I have to say. I have my doubts, but it's always a pleasure to interact with Royal Africa Society and a pleasure to be on this webinar. Let me say at the very outset, to try and shake it up a little, is from my perspective, there's no justification for this war by the Russian Federation on Ukraine in any shape or form. The history of Ukraine doesn't justify it. Aspirant NATO membership doesn't justify it. Whether Ukraine wants to pursue EU membership or a form of liberal democracy that Russia doesn't like doesn't justify it. The Cold War doesn't justify it, and the narrative of so-called Nazis doesn't justify it, or of Russian minorities requiring liberation equally doesn't justify it. It's also a position in supporting Russia, and I'll come to that in a second, that seems to be radically out of sync with the majority of Africans. If you look at the recent Economist poll, for example, which was the first to properly measure local responses to the war, it found that the overwhelming majority of those polled across Africa are against or strongly against the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In my own country, it was some 60% of the population, and the position of those who are strongly in favor of it was about 10% of the population. So this seems to fly in the face of what we actually know about African support, as opposed to interpret support, is that we know that on the 2nd of March, 141 nations passed a resolution at the UN General Assembly condemning Russia's aggression against Ukraine and asking for it to unconditionally withdraw. And just 5 countries came out in support of Russia, including Eritrea. But both the African Union and ECOWAS, very notably, condemned the aggression, as did all 3 of Africa's representatives on the Security Council, as was said a moment ago, Kenya, Gabon, and Ghana. Perhaps more interesting, however, is the list of countries that chose not to take a stance, and 34 members abstained from the vote. Predictably, this included China and India. But half of the abstentions, some 17 of them, came from Africa, and another 7 African countries refused to vote at all. It's, I think, hugely problematic and certainly questionable why these 17 countries would refuse to condemn Russia's imperial ambitions in Ukraine. And of course, as a South African, I would say that we just had Human Rights Day pass this week on the 21st. Why would South Africa, a nation that's prided itself as standing up to the world's downtrodden end of apartheid, why would they refuse to condemn Russia, particularly given the scale of the attacks on civilian areas, which only seem to be getting worse rather than staying away from them? And some people contend that this is down to history, it's down to politics and mercenaries. But I believe that there's more to it. It's also about money. It's also about the appeal of the type of oligarchy that Putin represents, and the appeal also of authoritarianism. It's very notable that Yoweri Museveni's son immediately tweeted his support for the Russians in this regard. And I think just very briefly, just to run through, I wrote down 10 reasons before this meeting. I think there's reasons of nostalgia, of Cold War nostalgia, as Nick pointed out at the start, but it doesn't really stack up in the modern world, since Ukraine was in fact part of the Soviet Union that provided support. And in fact, about a third of South Africa's own Umkhonto we Sizwe guerrilla operatives were trained in what is now Ukraine. Of course, it was a big arms supply also to the liberation movements. I think the second reason is that of ideology and colonialism. There's a sort of anti-hero in Putin, someone who seems to stick it up the nose of the West, that the BRICS represent in some shape or form an alternative to this. But as Martin Kamani, and without putting words in his mouth, reminded us, been cited before, in fact, Russia's actions are a vision of colonialism 2.0. A third reason is, which is sometimes mooted, is that Africa is worried about the economic concerns, and particularly about the price of commodities, which of course have skyrocketed. And Russia's 10% of Africa's wheat and of 18% of global wheat imports, which is about 200 million metric tons a year, and Ukraine into that figure. And Africa, of course, is a net wheat importer, on somewhere around about the 30 million ton mark, and imports account for about 2/3 of that figure, and about a third of that is from Russia, and 12% of that is from Ukraine. But you would have to say then that if this was your act for this crisis and speak out against this crisis rather than after the crisis, trying to do. Unfortunately, military support by Russia.
My apologies for interrupting you, Greg, but we are having some challenges hearing
Mali, and they have been known to employ Russian mercenaries, laying down more bandwidth in Lusaka. Is that better? Should I turn my video off? Would that help?
Yes, I think.
Okay, let me try that.
Thank you.
Let me try that. I think a fifth reason is a fear of China's response and its relationship with Russia. But I think that to some extent that's proven to be unfounded. And certainly Africa doesn't want to be caught in a giant sort of pincer between China as a major provider of debt and of infrastructure, among other things. But so far, China's pretty much stayed out of this. There's an argument out there that somehow Putin's attack on Ukraine is justified because of the West's antics in places like Libya, Iraq, and Afghanistan. But I do think that at least some of those, certainly Libya and Iraq, from my perspective, were unjustified and wrong. And it's wrong now. So you call them for what they are at the time, rather than trying to justify another incorrect action. Another reason that's sometimes cited is that South Africa, and this is particularly a South African line, is that we can play a role in mediating an end to the conflict. But you need to be even-handed. You need to appear neutral in so doing. And I think not even the most enthusiastic supporters of South African diplomacy would consider us at this stage of this to be neutral. Some people believe that this is justified. There's an element of Africans, that 10% I spoke of, who think that, Russia was right to do what it has done, which is deeply concerning for all of the reasons that have been raised. And then I think finally there is this belief out there, particularly from the more authoritarian of the elites, that actually Putin represents a great model, which is a model of essentially staying in power for as long as you want to and making large amounts of money in the process. And that this represents a challenge to him, so that he is going to be supported by abstaining in most instances as a consequence of this. Now, I mean, I think it's curious that of those countries that approved the General Assembly motion, they represent some 71% of global GDP and less than half of the globe's population. Of those that abstained, this represents 23% of global GDP. And if you take China out of that number of abstentions, it falls to 6%. So China is the big number there. And the countries that oppose about 2% of global GDP. So the weight of the global economy, the weight of progress, the weight of openness, the weight of progressive forces is actually with the majority. And I think we should take heart out of that in this regard. Now, just a couple of last points. I mean, a lot's going to depend now on what happens in Ukraine. As this war goes into a war of siege warfare, of attrition, of attacks against civilians, it clearly has gone into a different phase and it's going to get ground out, barring a peace deal, over a very long period of time. Of course, it's very questionable that whether Putin survives this. You know, if they have done as badly as some of the reportage has indicated, there'll be some Russians, not least those who've lost a lot of money in the process, who are going to be very upset about this. But I think there are a couple of very important consequences for Africa. I do think the extent and rapidity of sanctions has, I think, probably scared a few authoritarians in the continent, and it possibly should. It's shown a hitherto as unknown level of political will, as was also indicated earlier, on the part of the European Union. But if the NATO action in Ukraine is seen to be meaningful, it needs to apply the same standards on human rights and on territorial integrity and on democracy to Africa as it's applied to Ukraine. And I think that's actually where the double standard is that Europe doesn't, pay that much attention because its vital interests are not affected for the most part in Africa. So it largely is a bit player. The point that was made earlier about the economic consequences of this, I think, are tremendous. The economic consequences are likely to be dramatic because this comes at a moment of rising inflation, conditions that were present before the conflict, and this has been exacerbated by the Fed rate changes and by the higher oil price. And this is going to drive up the cost of African borrowing at the exact moment that Africa's demography is changing and maturing. Why invest in Africa when much safer geographies in the West, in other words, this will be the question asked in boardrooms, have much higher yields? Now, this is to an extent going to be partly offset by higher commodity prices, which benefits a minority of African countries. But a lot of African countries are going to be, their conditions are going to be worsened by the majority being net oil importers. And then the last point I would make, and this is just to really reiterate the points that are made by Nick and others, is, I think the big casualty, but it may only be wounded rather than fatally wounded. The big casualty is of global integration. The progression of international relations since the end of the Second World War, which was, of course, centered on Ukraine and Russia, among others, the progression of international relations, I think, has so far been a casualty. And this is very much a throwback to the past, a throwback to where, might solve these problems. And I think in all of this, it teaches us the importance of maintaining that progression, of maintaining those levels of integration, of having a value-based foreign policy. And perhaps more than anything, and I'll end on this note because it is, I think, reflective of what you see in the difference between Putin and Zelensky, is it teaches us the importance of leadership. And I think that's the one big takeout from this, is to be strategic and to have a narrative. You need to have leadership that's active and uses its resources and opportunities to do that. So I take some negatives out of this, but I also take some positives.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Greg, for that array of ideas, and also expanding on what others have already shared in terms of Africa's position and how we got there, and also the impacts. So now, audience members, I would like just to remind you that the Q&A box is available for you to put in your questions and your comments. Already quite a number have been coming in. There are a number of comments that have been made, just either in agreement or buttressing some of the points that our panelists have made. Points around alignment, how African countries should align in terms of their interests and where those lie. And I think that's in direct response to Cheta. Some agreement with you, Greg, on that there is no justification for the conflict, but also others coming back to say great powers never justify wars. So do we have an either or situation or a both and situation? I think there was also a comment which we will pose as a question to all the speakers, and I think all of you alluded to this idea of how foreign policy and also the position of African countries comes about. Where does it come from? How do you arrive at that point? So questions of mutuality between citizens and their governments, for example. So there is a question to you, Greg, about the Economist poll that you referred to, and if it is representative truly of the views of Africans. And they say, since so the Economist usually justifies other wars that have cost millions of lives. So how reliable is this when we are thinking about this situation? But I think a question to each of you on who should be making this decision. How should we be arriving at how Africa should respond? There are also some questions in the Q&A box that I will pose to each of you, and you can take what applies to you directly, or also comment on others that you think you would want to. The first question is to you, Murithi, directly. You mentioned the role of Russian private military companies, for example, Wagner in Central African Republic and elsewhere. How have international organizations reacted to this? What preparations have they made? Should they be withdrawn or indeed reinforced post the conflict? And this is also a question perhaps to you, Nick, as well, if you would want to intervene on that. There is another question which I think everyone can respond to, that the UN General Assembly is currently discussing 2 resolutions on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. One of them has been proposed by South Africa with the support of Russia. The question, though, is what kind of pressure can this exert to African states, or what leverage, I suppose, would this offer for African states? And then we'll take a last question for this round, which is again directed to you, Greg. Oh, this was that someone was not very clear the time that we lost you a little bit. So maybe we can come back to that. Can we take that set of questions for now? And then we'll come back to address others as they are coming in. And thank you very much, audience members, for your questions. So let's begin. I think let's begin with Nick. Nick, I see you've put your video on. So let's begin with you, and then we will go to Cheta, and then to Greg, and then Murithi, in that order. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I should probably go last, but as I'm here, the question is, how do we assure security in the areas of instability in Africa, which both Murithi and Cheta pointed out are the points of greatest vulnerability to falling under the question of spheres of influence, great power, rivalry, foreign intervention. And I think this comes back to Murithi's last point. Africa actually has to take responsibility for its own security, and it has to prove it can be effective in that. And the African Union has been doing a lot. It's been doing a lot more recently, but it still lacks resources. And it requires that coordination, that cooperation between the AU and UN to ensure that there is the feasibility of achieving stability. And it's interesting, why does Mali get rid of the French but go to the Russians? You know, why not get the UN and the AU to come in? Is it just because the Russians offer and will do their best to keep the current regime in power rather than actually solve the political problem and bring peace? And I think I will be very interested to see whether the African Union realizes there is a big role for it in this current global situation to ensure that Africa doesn't become, as it was in the Cold War, a victim of great power rivalry. The Cold War was not good for Africa. It helped achieve some liberation, but it produced great poverty, and it caused both sides to support authoritarian governments, not allow African people themselves to express the view of who their government should be. But that, I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Nick. Let's come to you, Cheta.
Okay, thank you. I think that there's a big issue here with respect to the African Union. The African Union, unlike the European Union, is not financially solid. And to maintain security and peace, as it were, around the continent, to maintain order, it needs to be able to raise an army, in a manner of speaking, and finance that army. That can't happen without outside help, whether it's from the West, whether it's from China, whether it's from Russia. Another important thing that is problematic for the African Union is that in the eyes of many people in different parts of the continent, it has lost legitimacy. And that's because of this attitude that the African Union has had for a long time of being an old boys club, which doesn't say anything about the malfeasance carried out by various African leaders within their countries. This was one of the reasons why the Organization of African Unity transited into the African Union. I remember that long meeting in South Africa between where Thabo Mbeki and Olusegun Obasanjo tried to breathe a new lease of life into the Organization of African Unity, and we ended up with the African Union. But unfortunately, old habits die hard. And as we have seen in various coups that have happened in the last few years in various parts of the continent, the African Union has not taken a strong stand. So when you have illegitimate leaders, as it were, in various parts of the continent, attending African Union meetings, then the African Union really has not much to say. Having said that, I would go out on a limb and say that unfortunately we've seen the return of geopolitics with a vengeance here. I think that we need to, and I think this is building up from what Greg said, but going off on a tangent. I think we need to understand that there are different mindsets when it comes to international politics. The Western mindset tends to think in terms of the economy. One thing that I would give the Western countries is that they think about economic growth first and front and center. The mindset of people like Vladimir Putin is quite different. Economic growth is not their priority. Hard power is. So I would say that we would come out with a situation where Putin paradoxically would end up stronger within his country, which we must remember is a nuclear-armed military superpower. I think that a lot of what we have seen as per the Russian performance in the battlefield in Ukraine, as it were, is what I'll call the fog of war. The invasion is just a month old now. Tomorrow makes it exactly 4 weeks. And this is an adversary that has been equipped, as it were, by Western powers. A lot of weapons have flowed in. Now, compare with the American invasion of Iraq. There was no comparison between the military strength of both powers, yet it took the Americans somewhere between 6 and 8 weeks to subdue the Iraqis. So there's a lot of fog of war going on, and the objectives, I think, are different. What Putin wants is for Ukraine to be a wreck. That is what he wants. And I think in many respects he's achieving it. I think that the sanctions regime has only pushed him into a stronger position within his own country, and pushed him tighter into the hands of China. So what will happen is, as an example, things like payment systems, Visa, MasterCard, will become national security issues. And those of us who don't have the kind of internal fiber optic networks, for example, that are needed to make these things work, we'll be forced to choose, or we'll be forced to use multiple systems. So that's the direction the world is headed. It's unfortunate, but I think that's the direction we are headed. Now, what are the strategic long-term interests of African countries in the ongoing conflict in Ukraine? That's a question that was asked in the chat box. I think one of those things is the fact that between themselves, Russia and Ukraine are responsible for a lot of the world's wheat. If that supply continues to dwindle, we are going to see social problems in various African countries. I would say that's probably the first one would be Egypt. When a hungry man is an angry man, to quote Bob Marley, and when you have people who are hungry, given high rates of unemployment and high inflation rates, this is going to become problematic for African countries. So what African countries should be looking at in the interim is how to shore up food supplies for their people. I think that's the first thing we should be thinking of. And if the AU was going to intervene in one way, it should be to find ways to fill this gap very, very quickly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cheta. Greg, I will come to you and then Murili to you, but I'll ask each of you to be a little bit brief in your responses so we can take another round before we come to the end.
Thanks. I'll turn my screen off again. So I'm here. It's not pre-recorded, and I'll try and answer it incognito. Just one specific question, which was the question about the Economist poll. I mean, I guess given that it's an Economist poll, it has probably a fairly clear methodology. But I do always, take complaints about the poll finding the answers that you don't like, so therefore you shoot the messenger or decry the methodology or decry the magazine. But produce your own poll. Let's see what the results are across Africa, and I hope that more polls are done. But I suspect that given the kind of routine polling we've seen from places like Afrobarometer, which is an unbelievable asset to most African or all African researchers, the commitment to democracy across Africa, roughly around 2/3 to 70%, depending on the year, I think is indicative of what most Africans feel about this conflict, because they're supporting the small guy, and they're supporting the democracy because that's what they want to be like. But we can take that up in questions. Let me make some bold assertions. I would say that, and there's always a danger here, never say never, but I would say that firstly, one of the things that's going to happen out of this, which is a positive, is that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is probably off the cards. The Chinese would have, and I think the lukewarm nature of their response to Russia is indicative of this. They're really interested in making money, not going to war. They would have seen how difficult it is to mount a modern military operation, even in a pretty large territory like Ukraine, which is very difficult to defend. But secondly, after Afghanistan, which had Western credibility, I think the Western responsibility of it, and certainly the way in which it really utilized intelligence literally to the day to predict that the war was going to happen. But of course it did happen. And it pretty much, they predicted the very moment that it would happen. My sense about Putin is that he is a reminder very much of the old Europe. He is surrounded by the new Europe. He is reminded every day that he looks out around Eastern and Central Europe, the failure of the Soviet type system. Just look at Poland, look at the Baltics. These are countries which in 30 years have completely revolutionized themselves. And I suspect that this is as much about trying to reinvent or reimagine a past and go backwards out of fear of what that relative liberalism produces than anything else. And particularly, which is, sitting right there on the border next to Ukraine, next to Belarus, but also the Czech Republic and Slovakia and others. I do think it is also really shown how sanctions can work. I mean, we might like to talk about, if sanctions regimes like this were applied in certain instances in Africa, I mean, there would be a dramatic impact. I suspect very much that sanctions, if they remain, are going to hurt, if they remain, and it's a big if, will hurt the Russians considerably, and particularly if oil and gas sanctions are applied, and that's $1 billion a day into the Russian economy, which will be switched off. And it's not only hurting the Russian economy and normal Russians, of course, it's going to ultimately hurt the oligarchs and those around Putin. The question really is, I think, the most relevant question is, how do we get out of this? All wars come to an end. It's usually preceded by a ceasefire. It usually involves some degree of deal making. It's hard to imagine right now the two positions are so at opposite ends of the table. But what is the deal going to be? And what we know from peacemaking elsewhere, and I think this is where we do have a certain comparative advantage, is that you need external pressure on all the parties to settle. I think it was the Chinese on Russia, for instance.
Greg, I'm going to
a degree
have
of
to
method and timing and leadership.
Interrupt you.
Sure.
Sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt you. Yes, please wrap up.
Let me just make, and you need obviously more to be gained by ending fighting than continuing with it. And I do think, and this applies directly to Mali and other instances of weak states, is that we've learned from this conflict that military power, security, is fundamentally as much about political will as it is about external support and weaponry. And that's, I think, a very important aspect to bear in mind when we contemplate how to go about rebuilding certain areas of the continent, particularly in the Sahel. Let me end there.
Thank you very much, Greg. And Murithi, I'm going to come to you, and perhaps I'm going to also ask you to make any kind of concluding remarks that you'd like to. And also, I will come back to Cheta and Greg for very, very short concluding remarks, but there is one question that has been put on the table, which is about the treatment of Africans that we have seen in this conflict, whether it's on social media or on mainstream media. And what this means, a lot of our audience members are raising the point that there is a lot of hypocrisy, there's a lot of double standards, especially in the treatment of Africans. There is also quite a lot of debate, I think, on some of the points that have been put on the table, and points being made about Africans' real position on this, that there is a genuine sentiment in the continent for a desire for a world that looks different, for a world where global power and how it's held looks different. So Murithi, I'm throwing you under the bus here and asking you to also make some very short remarks or reflections on that in the short time we have remaining. So Murithi, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Shuvai. And I think I'll pick up on the quite specific question about what might happen if the Russians pull out of places in the Sahel, Chad, CAR, and Sudan and elsewhere. I would say that, broadly in the Sahel, I think they learned the wrong lessons from the failed war on terror, the global war on terror, so-called because, all the efforts to stamp out militant activity by force have bred more militancy, unfortunately, in many parts of the continent. I think what the likes of Mali, the likes of Niger, Burkina Faso, and others need to do is embrace an alternative approach. The Malians, for example, have mulled about talking to the jihadis, some of which groups might not be transnational necessarily. And so it might not be a terrible thing if the French pull out, the Russians pull out, but local elites really try to confront the issues that breed insecurity, especially the distance between elites and their peripheries, the lack of governance. It's a very complex sets of issues, but certainly there's no military solution. And so I saw a question about Eritrea, they have been isolated for a long time. They will just have enjoyed, thumping their nose at the West. But I don't think Eritrea is a particularly pertinent example. I think it's an outlier. It's one that doesn't embrace multilateralism even within the Horn, and it's not a good example. I saw a quick question about Ethiopia. We certainly agree that the situation there is very grave. I think the position we've been advocating at Crisis Group is that they need to move to a cessation of hostilities before any national dialogue. Just closing remarks, I would just agree with Nick. Cultivating stronger multilateralism. We've seen ECOWAS, the West African bloc, for example, in some cases be quite effective in trying to stamp out instability within that region. So just looking for more homegrown solutions, which can be a bit of a rhetorical crutch, but really, I think cultivating stronger multilateralism, governments putting in more funds into the African Union, as Cheta said, but the AU itself being more creative and accountable. I think those will be important steps in an age of potential disruption.
Thank you so much, Murithi, for those concluding remarks as well, and responding to some of the comments in the questions. None of our panelists have as yet responded to the issue of the treatment of Africans. So audience members, I hope one of them will as they conclude. But I think there is also a very big question on the table that Nick and Hoda maybe will be the subject of another conversation, which is around some of the views that have been shared and an alternative world order that perhaps is being articulated, whether it's verbally or in other ways by African citizens. But Greg, I'll invite you to make just one concluding statement, and then Cheta, you will go after Greg, and then I'll hand over back to Nick. So Greg?
Okay, so no one's tackled the folk leaving Ukraine. I was on the border, the Polish-Ukrainian border, for the first week of the war. And I saw many, many people, I can only say what I saw with my own eyes, coming over the border of all shapes and sizes and colors and hues and everything else, including large numbers of African refugees. I didn't see personally what people refer to. I'm pretty sure in the chaos of the conflict, there have been all sorts of instances of discrimination and prejudice and bigotry, probably among Ukrainians themselves. But that's clearly a seminar for an entirely different session. But I do think the point is large numbers of African students were in Ukraine doing courses. And I do think we never look at that. We always look at the negative downsides and we say, oh, those African students are extremely poorly treated. Well, they were there and on scholarships, most of them. I just want to end with a question, if I can, and very briefly. Otherwise, Nick's going to send me another note. And that is, I wonder if the African countries that have supported Russia by abstaining or directly supported it are going to suffer the consequences in terms of Western donor assistance. I know that African nations have shown very clearly that once again, the West should never take them for granted. And that's definitively the case. And I guess the outcome of this depends to an extent on who wins or who doesn't lose. But I do think, when you're taking money and with one hand and then basically slapping the face of the donor with the other is probably at some point going to have consequences.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Greg, for that question that you're leaving us with, and a lot of food for thought, as usual. Cheta, over to you.
Thank you. I'd like to end by, to start my ending by contradicting Greg a bit. I wasn't at the Poland-Ukraine border, but I personally know some people who were turned back and eventually found their way to Romania and were evacuated by the Nigerian government. Having said that, I think that there is a residual superiority complex in the West towards Africa, or let me use the expression, towards brown and Black people. We cannot deny that it exists. I think that we will turn that around when we begin to get our act together. So it's the onus is on us. It's the economy stupid. We need to actually get more of our people, lift more of our people out of poverty. We can't continue being the world's beggar and being at the mercy of everybody else when conflicts like this arise. One of the big worries is that we are simply a geopolitical playground. Unfortunately, that's what it's going to be for the greater part of this century. Like I said in my opening remarks, as the borders break down, this geopolitical competition will become more intense. So we need to start thinking forward towards such a time, because that's going to be a problem for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. And Murithi, at the risk of never being invited again by the Royal African Society, I'm going to give you just 30 seconds to give us a final thought.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think, Cheta's point is pertinent. I think what we need in the world is greater empathy. And, I've been amused actually that many in the West were shocked that African nations would take one position or the other, but that means they haven't been listening to each other. And so certainly people communicating more, understanding the very lively perspectives we've seen in the chat box, for example, I think will just make for more informed policy making going forward.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Murithi. And I think as I hand over to Nick, I would just like to thank you all panelists for inspiring this very energetic conversation. And there were so many comments and questions that we didn't have enough time to cover them. But I think certainly, Nick, you have enough ingredients for a future conversation. I would also like to reiterate this very last point around conversations and what conversations are taking place around this issue, and in particular, the African conversation and the contribution to what is happening in Ukraine. And there is so much, I think, so much to pay attention to, I think, as Cheta and Greg and Murithi have highlighted today. And of course, our wonderful audience who have been extremely, extremely lively. There are a lot of resources that have been shared in the chat and in the Q&A box. So please do take a look at those resources, a number of opinion pieces that have been penned by several members of the audience, as well as our panelists. So thank you so much for this opportunity. And I have really been inspired, and my brain has been very exercised. So Nick, thank you so much.
Thank you, Shuvai. And I think we've packed a huge amount into an hour. This conversation could go on for hours and days. And like you, I've been really impressed by the eloquence of the views expressed in the chat. And the recording will be available afterwards if people want to go back or refer to some of the points made. There is a divergence of view on this. I think on the student question, I mean, there is no question there was some appalling behavior. Some specific cases, they've been widely circulated, seem to be entirely justified. They were at the outset. There has been some action taken since then to ensure that those sort of things don't happen, but it's deeply damaging to the image of those supporting Ukraine that this happened, because world opinion matters, African opinions on this matter, because there needs to bring this war to an end to be a concerted international position that this war is bad for everybody in practice. And Greg made the point about the costs to African development from wheat, from prices, from oil prices, that will severely disadvantage many African countries. And that will only stop when the war stops. So there's a huge interest, and Africa's voice needs to be included in that. Perhaps more to the point is, as Murithi says, the leaders of those who support Ukraine need to listen to what is being said. Because if we're to have an international system that genuinely values sovereignty and provides a multilateral system that can cope and prevent these kind of conflicts, it's got to be stronger, and Africa's position in it needs to be stronger. And I think that's a really important conclusion to draw from this. And I hope Western policymakers are listening to this point. But the detriment to Africa of the conflict continuing, I think, is very clear and is only going to expand. And that came across clearly in our discussion today. So I think, Shuvai, to answer your question, I think we have about half a dozen different panel discussions that could develop from this. And I'm very grateful to Marithi, to Cheta, to Greg, and to yourself again for joining us today, and all the audience, and for their very active contribution. And we will be returning to this subject again, and do please pass on the recording of this to other people who may be interested in it who couldn't attend today. And while you're about it, please check on our website and do join the Royal African Society so you can participate in more of these debates. But thanks very much to everybody for all the contributions, and we look forward to seeing you at the next event. Thanks and good night.